Third story, the silent neighbors. I never paid much attention to the house across the street. It was just another worn-out suburban home in Willow Creek, a small town where nothing ever happened. The elderly couple who lived there, Mr. and Mrs. Whitaker, were quiet, polite, and mostly kept to themselves. Then, kids started disappearing. It began with Daniel Pierce, a 10-year-old boy who rode his bike around the block every evening. One day, he just vanished. His bike was found abandoned near the old train tracks. A week later, Emily Carter, a 7-year-old girl, went missing while playing in her backyard. The town was in panic. Parents kept their children indoors, and the police patrolled the streets day and night. I didn't think much of the Whitakers until one night when I saw something strange. I had trouble sleeping and got up for a drink of water. From my kitchen window, I noticed movement in their backyard. The old couple was out there, digging. At first, I thought nothing of it, but then I saw something that sent chills down my spine. A small hand, pale and lifeless, poked out of the dirt before Mr. Whitaker quickly shoved more soil over it. I stumbled back from the window, my heart racing. I knew I had to call the police, but I also knew I needed proof. So, like an idiot, I decided to investigate myself. That night, I grabbed my phone and snuck out, crossing the street under the cover of darkness. Their backyard smelled like damp earth and something else, something rotten. My hands shook as I turned on my phone's flashlight and aimed it at the freshly dug dirt. That's when I heard the creak of the back door. I turned just in time to see Mrs. Whitaker standing in the doorway, her face half hidden in the shadows. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. Before I could react, something heavy struck the back of my head. When I woke up, I was inside their house, in a basement I didn't know existed. The air was thick with the stench of decay. My hands were tied, and my head throbbed from the blow. Dim light flickered from a single bulb, revealing wooden crates stacked against the walls. My stomach twisted as I noticed the scratches on the inside of the crates. Some were fresh. Then I heard it, a faint whimper. I turned my head and saw them, the missing kids. Their eyes were hollow, their faces streaked with dirt and dried tears. They were locked in cages like animals. Footsteps echoed down the stairs. The Whitakers. "We were going to take care of them," Mrs. Whitaker murmured, her voice eerily calm. "But they never last long." Mr. Whitaker reached for something behind him, a hammer. Panic surged through me, and I did the only thing I could. I kicked the table beside me, knocking over a lantern. The flame caught on the old wooden floor, spreading instantly. The Whitakers screamed as the fire grew. I managed to untie myself in the chaos, kicking open the nearest cage. The kids scrambled out, their weak limbs barely able to carry them. Smoke choked my lungs as I led them upstairs, through the flames, out the front door. We barely made it before the entire house went up in a roaring blaze. The police arrived minutes later. The fire revealed the horrors hidden beneath the Whitakers' home. Shallow graves, makeshift cages, remnants of children who weren't so lucky. The old couple didn't make it out. For weeks, the town buzzed with horror and disbelief. I couldn't sleep knowing what had been lurking so close all these years. I thought it was over, until I received a letter in my mailbox. It was old, yellowed, the handwriting shaky. Just 4 words: "We never worked alone." Second story, the man next door. I never thought much about my neighbor. Mr. Grayson was just another old man living alone in the house next to mine, a quiet guy who rarely spoke. He had a hunched back, wore thick glasses, and always shuffled around his overgrown yard like a ghost. At first, I pitied him. Then I started noticing things. It began with the sounds. At night, long after the neighborhood had gone silent, I'd hear scraping noises through my bedroom wall. It was a slow, rhythmic sound, like someone dragging something heavy across a wooden floor. Sometimes there were muffled voices, low, desperate whispers that made my skin crawl. One night I heard a thud, followed by a sharp cry. It was quick, cut off too suddenly, like someone had been silenced. My stomach twisted, but I told myself I was imagining things. People don't just scream in the middle of the night in normal neighborhoods, right? Then came the smell. A few weeks later, a rotten, sour stench seeped from Mr. Grayson's yard. It was the kind of smell that made my throat tighten, like dead animals left to decay in the sun. Flies buzzed around his trash cans, thick clouds of them. My gut told me to stay away, but curiosity got the better of me. I started watching him. Every night, just before midnight, Mr. Grayson would leave his house, carrying something heavy wrapped in a tarp. He always moved quickly, looking around like he expected someone to be watching. He'd disappear into the woods behind our houses, staying there for hours before coming back empty-handed. One night, I decided to follow him. I waited until he vanished into the trees, then crept after him, staying low. The deeper I went, the stronger the smell got. My hands shook as I pushed through the thick underbrush, my heart pounding. Then I saw it, a pit, a deep, dark hole dug into the earth, filled with something I couldn't quite make out at first. But as I stepped closer, my stomach clenched. Bones, human bones. Some still had flesh clinging to them, others picked clean. My breath hitched in my throat. Then I heard it, a soft crunch behind me. I spun around and there he was, Mr. Grayson, standing inches away. His thick glasses reflected the moonlight, his face twisted into something inhuman. His hands were covered in dirt, his fingernails blackened. "You shouldn't be here," he whispered. His voice was calm, too calm. For a moment we just stood there, locked in place. Then he moved. I ran. Branches tore at my skin, but I didn't stop. I burst out of the woods and into my house, locking the door behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps. My hands fumbled for my phone, dialing 911 with shaking fingers. The police arrived minutes later, but when they searched the woods, the pit was gone. The ground looked freshly covered, no bones, no sign of anything. And Mr. Grayson? He stood on his porch, watching me with a slow, knowing smile. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face, heard his voice. The next morning, I found a single bone on my doorstep, a human finger bone, picked clean. I moved out that same day. For years, I told myself it was over, that I had escaped. But then last week, a new family moved into my old house. And tonight, as I lay awake in my apartment across town, my phone buzzes with a message from an unknown number. "Do you hear the scraping?" First story. The House of Whispers. I moved to Millbrook, Pennsylvania for a fresh start. A quiet suburban town, just the way I liked it. The house I bought was at the end of a cul-de-sac with only one neighbor, an elderly couple named the Whitmans. The first time I met them, they stood in their yard just watching me. Mr. Whitman had deep-set eyes sunken into his skull, while Mrs. Whitman's mouth curled into a permanent, unsettling smile. When I waved, only she responded, raising her hand in slow motion, like a marionette. The first strange thing happened on my second night. Around midnight, I heard whispering. It wasn't coming from inside my house. It was coming from theirs. My bedroom window faced their home, and through their thin curtains, I saw shadows moving. The whispering turned into a hushed argument, followed by something heavy dragging across the floor. The next morning, I saw Mr. Whitman in his yard. He waved, but his hand was wrapped in bandages. "Everything okay last night?" I asked, trying to sound casual. His smile twitched. "Oh, just some housework. Gets loud sometimes." That night, the whispering started again. I couldn't make out words, just the rhythm, fast, frantic, desperate. Then, a single loud knock. Not on my door, on theirs. Silence. The next day, I saw Mrs. Whitman sitting on their porch. Her dress was stained, something dark, almost black. She didn't look at me, just rocked in her chair, mumbling. I couldn't take it anymore. That evening, I knocked on their door. No answer. I knocked again. The door creaked open. The house smelled like rot. I stepped inside. "Mr. Whitman?" My voice barely echoed in the stillness. A sound came from upstairs, a dragging sound. I turned toward the staircase just as something moved in my peripheral vision. Mrs. Whitman stood at the end of the hall, half hidden in the shadows. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. I should have listened. A heavy thump came from above, then another. Footsteps, slow and deliberate, descending the stairs. Mr. Whitman appeared, but he was wrong. His head tilted at an unnatural angle, his arms too long, his fingers twitching like an insect's legs. His lips barely moved as he whispered, "You shouldn't be here." I bolted for the door, but Mrs. Whitman grabbed my wrist with an iron grip. Her skin was cold, her nails digging into my flesh. "He doesn't like visitors," she murmured. I yanked free and stumbled outside. The door slammed shut behind me. The next morning, the Whitmans' house was empty. The windows were boarded up. A "for sale" sign stood crooked in their yard, covered in dust. I called the real estate agent. "The Whitmans moved out?" Silence. Then, "Sir, that house has been abandoned for 15 years. The last owners, well, they disappeared. I stared at the house. The curtains moved slightly, as if someone was peering out. Then, just for a second, I heard it again, the whispering.